If you've ever looked at a grungy rental property and wondered how it could possibly cost so much, there's a reason. And it's not simply just supply and demand. To tell us what's really happening, we're joined by University of North Florida professor David Jaffee, director of the school's Jax Rental Housing Project. Hey, David.
Hi. Thanks for having us.
And Katelyn Renzi, sociology and political science student at UNF and author of this important study. Hey, Katelyn.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for being here. So, Katelyn, it's hard to focus on just a single takeaway from this report. The findings are really layered. They're really shocking. But I know that you've presented this report at length. What is sort of your elevator pitch?
So I found in my study, which was looking at, ownership of all of these apartments in Jacksonville, 600 in total, that 75% of them were owned by either investment firms or real estate firms. And those firms charge far more money and evict far more people than individual investors, especially local residents. And so it's causing worse conditions for tenants. And then that also is causing sort of slumlords to take this, gap in affordable housing and offer worse conditions for tenants and also evict higher portions of residents. And it creates this relationship between investment firms who extract money from tenants through increasing rents, and this condition with slumlords where they're offering worse conditions but for lower rents. And it really squeezes tenants in between, rock and a hard place.
So your report starts out by saying that more than 40% of Duval County residents are essentially renters, and half of them live in what are called multifamily units.
Right.
So what are multifamily units? Those are basically what we think of as kind of larger apartment complexes?
Multifamily units can be anything from, 2 to 100 plus units. Larger apartment complexes, you're talking 200 to 300 units, but apartment complexes can be as small as, a quad or a duplex.
Mm-hmm. And so you have found that many of these in the Jacksonville area are owned by the same companies, the
Yes.
same global investment firms.
Yes.
But they have this sort of LLC disguise. Explain what that is and how that functions.
Yeah. So a lot of these companies will own, 5, 6 properties, and each of them will have separate LLCs. And it makes it really hard for tenants who are living in these properties to know who their real landlord is. They may know their property manager and think that's the owner, but often that's not the case. There's this, far larger LLC that actually owns it. And even if you go and try to find, okay, who is this LLC that owns my property? There may be, several layers of LLC that's trying to block the identity of this ultimate owner.
And that serves what purpose? I mean, it does obscure who owns the property. Yeah. How does that serve the companies themselves, the investment companies?
Well, it makes it harder for them to be held accountable. When there are tenants that are like, my rent has gone up, $200-$300 year to year, it's hard to point fingers because the property manager is saying, hey, it's not us, it's the owner. But it's like, how do you know who the owner is?
Mm-hmm. David Jaffee, there's also a relationship that you found and that Katelyn found in this report between LLC ownership and property neglect. Explain to us what that is and why that is.
Yeah, let me just start by talking about the sort of core concept that's been driving what we've been doing. And basically, when we begin to gather data and analyze data on the situation in the rental housing market, the situation for tenants, we've arrived on the concept of the financialization of human shelter. And this lies pretty much at the center of how we understand what's happening to renters. And what that means is that we have in Jacksonville, and it's not exclusively in Jacksonville, this is happening in many other communities, you've got large corporate entities coming in. They're purchasing thousands of single-family homes. They're converting them into rental properties. They're bundling those rental properties into portfolios for their wealthy clients and investors and shareholders. So that's happening in the single-family side. The same thing is happening on the multifamily apartment side. So we see over the past 4 years, massive amount of acquisitions of multifamily apartment complexes in Jacksonville, again, by large corporate firms bundled together and put into portfolios. So that's what we mean by the financialization of human shelter. Human shelter, something that every person needs, is now being financialized as an asset. And the business model that's driving this is largely once these properties are acquired, raise the rent, add fees, and essentially cut costs. And cutting costs often means cutting maintenance costs. And this is the business model. And remember that they are promising their investors a certain return on their investment. And often it's somewhere between 10 and 15%. So given that promise, that financial promise, clearly the business model requires them to extract as much income as possible. And so what you have here is, on the one hand, you've got working class people trying to make ends meet, paying high rent on the one end. On the other end, you have investors collecting passive income from their investment. So this is essentially the expanding model of rental housing in Jacksonville, and it's not sustainable, and there simply is no way that we can move toward any kind of affordable housing solution under this system.
So we know that rents are high in Jacksonville. People are advised not to spend more than 30% of their income on rent or mortgage or whatever. More than half the people in Jacksonville, 53%, already spend 30% or more of their income. And almost 30% are spending half of their incomes, more than 50% of their incomes on rent. They're considered severely cost burdened. But what has changed, you've found, in terms of how these properties are being acquired and by whom, it really has happened in just the last couple of years, right? Since about 2019?
Yeah. A lot of the sales that you see with the multifamily complexes, especially the larger ones, it's since 2019, and some of these properties have been sold 2-3 times since then.
And so the rents very often are increased in that period. We've seen these rents go up quite a bit. And you found that in this city that people, in order not to be burdened, would have to make $25 an hour, essentially, in order to afford the median rent in Jacksonville. And that's just not what people make here.
That's right. Yeah. So we've also done an analysis of every occupational category in Jacksonville using the information we can get from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And basically, there's about 620 occupational categories. We can take the median hourly wage for each one of those. We can convert that into an annual income, assuming they work 40 hours a week, year round. And then we can calculate, what they could afford to keep them below being cost burdened, which is 30% of their income. And what we find is well over 50% of those occupations, based on the median hourly wage, would need to pay, if they wanted to be not cost burdened, they would need to be paying something less than $1,000. And
A month in rent.
Yes, in a month in rent. And only about 5%, maybe 5 to 10% of units or apartments in Jacksonville fall into that category. So, and often, when we interview tenants, and we learn a lot through these interviews that we can't pull out of the data. And one of the things we talk to them about is we say your cost burden. They say, what does that mean? We say, well, it means that 30% of your income or more is going to rent. And often they laugh at this because they say, I have never, ever not been cost burdened. So the 30% threshold, that is a standard. It's been widely used. Now we have the severely cost burdened at 50%. But the point is, for most tenants, 30% is a dream.
And to be clear, you're saying that about 40% of renters in Jacksonville would need $1,000 or less in rent in order not to be rent burdened, but there's only 5% of the housing, 5% of the available housing is $1,000 or less a month.
Yes, that's right.
So if you're just joining us, we're talking about why Duval is the eviction capital of Florida. If you have a rental story to share, you can join our conversation live on air. You can call 904-549-2937. You can email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. Katelyn, I want to return to something that you mentioned in terms of the property management companies. Very often people confuse them with the owner. They believe that that's the owner, but they do have a relationship with the owner. Sometimes they manage multiple properties for these large investment companies. Sometimes they're, as you call it, vertically integrated, kind of work for directly. How does that impact the way that they manage properties and what their incentives are?
Yeah, so with a lot of investment firms, if you've got, an incentive to keep your property management costs lower, you'll want to partner with one property management company, and that way you sort of cut down on, the overall management costs. But sort of the distinguisher that I made between real estate-owned apartment complexes and investment firms is that a lot of real estate companies will vertically integrate their property manager within their company, and they will save money on that end, but that's not necessarily being passed on to consumers. Real estate owned apartments still have, similar rates as investment firm owned apartments. But it's just a way for these companies to sort of keep some more of that money for themselves.
And when they are incentivized by these companies, I mean, maximizing profits is a big part of that. And so we mentioned fees. That is one way. Rent hikes are another. But another area, another way to kind of increase profits is to reduce what they offer. And how does that play out in real life?
I mean, when a new apartment complex takes over, it can result in slashing amenities. A lot of times, if a new apartment will take over, they may provide cosmetic improvements where they'll maybe repaint the property, but, they're repainting maybe mold, maybe, some other maintenance concerns. So, for that, higher cost of rent, you're really not getting any return on that.
We've got a call from Eugene on the north side. Good morning, Eugene. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. I have a question that's been concerning me about this whole process. Does the city officials up to the mayor and from the city level all the way up to the governor, does any of these folks have a responsibility to curtail this from happening?
Thanks, Eugene. David.
Well, I would hope that they would think they had a responsibility, and maybe there would be some effort to put in place some legislation. But so far, there's really a reluctance for public officials, and remember, we're in Florida, and so there's a political climate here, to intervene in any way that would restrict the ability of private actors to maximize profits. And so I think there's an awareness of this. Often the default explanation, which is insufficient in this case, is that, well, this is just a problem of supply and demand. There's a high demand for housing. There's a shortage of supply. That's all we need to do is supply more housing. And so we've had legislation that tends to focus almost exclusively on the supply side. You have supply side economics that has driven the American economy in trouble, I would say. We also have a supply side approach to understanding this, but unfortunately, just increasing the supply of housing is not going to be sufficient. The question really is who owns the housing and for what purpose? And in most cases, the housing is being owned by large corporate entities, where certainly people are investing in the supply of the housing, anticipating a certain profit. And so privately owned, for-profit housing simply is not going to meet the affordable housing needs of the renters. So there was the Live Local Act that was passed statewide. But again, that's largely a supply-side driven piece of legislation.
It also contained a rollback of, local government's ability to create any sort of tenant bill of rights. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and the same thing happened in 1998 with a statewide preemption on capping rents, on rent controls, especially during affordable housing crises, when other cities, not Jacksonville, but cities like Miami and Tampa were trying to pass laws that would curtail the ability of investors to hike up rents. And this was back in 1998. And then now, more recently, when you saw cities like Tampa and Orlando and Miami trying to pass tenants' bill of rights and sort of more restrictions on things like evictions and more, liability for these owners, the statewide or the state legislature preempted it. And yeah.
Okay. I'm going to take a call from Mark. Good morning, Mark. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. Your guest mentioned a little while ago about how this is unsustainable, and I get the appeal on the part of investors to invest in something that is not really a stock market. But I'm just curious, do you kind of envision this as a bubble, and at what point will there not be those returns? It'd be kind of like mandating everybody drive a Mercedes, but certainly not every citizen out there can afford a Mercedes. So at some point, you may have that desire, but it is unrealistic and it's unsustainable. So what does that look like when this bubble, for lack of a better word, bursts or passes by? Do you foresee rents coming back down to a more affordable consumer-driven level?
Good question.
I don't. You rarely see rents actually go down significantly. Now, they might stabilize, and they have recently, but they certainly haven't gone down. I think one of the issues is that some of these investors are overextended in terms of the amount of money they borrowed. That's going to impact in some way their exit, so to speak. Sometimes they use the term profitable disposal to talk about selling off a piece of property. So there could be some of that, but I don't anticipate that the bubble will be exactly the same. And again, you're talking about renters who need a place to live. So the market doesn't really work the way other kinds of markets do. Renters are going to take pretty much what they can find. And at some point, they need stability. And often you have families, you have children, and you just need to have a place that's affordable and safe, affordable relative to what's available in Jacksonville. So I don't anticipate rents going down. It would be good if they were stabilized, but we need an alternative model for affordable housing. This model is not sustainable in the sense that this is the expanding model, and it is driven largely by the acquisition of properties by large corporate entities, and the intent is to extract as much income from those properties. None of these corporate entities, by the way, are producing any housing. They're not building any housing. They're not developing any housing. They are acquiring current properties, multifamily and single family, and using those properties bundled together as a way to extract income, and often income for their investors or shareholders.
In the report, too, you talked not just about, rents rising, but rents are being set. And in fact, a lot of these companies are using a software to help them set these rates. That's something that's the subject of a federal investigation.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a investigation, I believe it was an Arizona-based real estate company. I don't think any of the ones that are involved in Jacksonville were brought in that lawsuit. But YieldStar, they have an algorithm that, based on a variety of community factors, how many bedrooms, how many square feet the apartment is, they're able to calculate what the most profitable amount of rent that an apartment can be set for. But in the case like Jacksonville, where probably 50% of overall apartment complexes are using this algorithm, it creates a situation where the algorithm is comparing rents that are set by the algorithm to other apartment complexes that also have rents set by the algorithm. And so it's almost like this, price fixing of this one company that is setting the prices for all of these apartment complexes that are all raising in response to the same apartment complexes.
One of the things that you found, and we alluded to earlier, was how the eviction crisis is particularly acute in Jacksonville, and the numbers bear out almost double the rate of other cities in the state. Tell us what you found in terms of the pace of evictions and what the connection is there in terms of this ownership model.
Well, Jacksonville is probably the least sympathetic large city, I would say, to tenants compared to other large cities. And so I think that the overall climate certainly has a part to play in it. But a lot of these companies are engaged in almost automatic evictions where their property manager will, sort of almost automatically file these evictions against residents. And there's not really any penalty for them to do so. This is just seen as like part of the profit extraction of them getting their rents. So there's not really any incentive for them not to.
We have a couple of emails I want to get to. Al emailed, just to add another layer to the conversation, if we don't know who the owners are, or who owns the property, can we suspect that some money laundering could be taking place? I don't know that there's any suggestion of that.
I don't know that that's the case, but if they go to the Jax Rental Housing website, we actually have a document that will tell you who the property manager is, if we know, for your property, and every single owner for all apartment complexes with 10 or more units in Jacksonville.
We should say, Katelyn did an incredible job of digging through this information using court records, property appraisal records, just searching the web for ownership records. And the document is linked on the First Coast Connect page on our website. You can find it there. And it really is a great resource. It also lists, we should say, this, ranking that you did of essentially the worst performers in the market in terms of the negative impact that they have by apartment complex and by owner.
Right.
So it's sort of a top 20 of each.
Yes. Yeah. And that's sort of the case is that, you will see patterns where certain firms that own, 6 or 7 apartment complexes, there's a common trend that a lot of them face high evictions. They also face high building code violations. So there are definitely more so problem tenants that pop out there. Owners, not tenants.
Tom on Facebook said the failure of the city and the state to invest in economic development locally is responsible for much of these evictions. Neighboring communities have been more successful in attracting manufacturing businesses and other job creators. Meanwhile, I've been noting a decline in offered starting wages and job listings in Jacksonville over the last 6 months. We also have a call from Les on the west side. Good morning, Les. Go ahead.
Good morning. Great show. I just wanted, as a Jacksonville native, we have a couple of rentals, and I just wanted to offer also the cost of insurance has gone up a lot in the last several years. If you carry rental insurance, it's tremendous.
Yeah, that's true. And that has obviously contributed to the overall
That's a
cost of
good
housing.
point. We do make a distinction between the corporate landlords and what we call sometimes the mom and pop or amateur landlords. There are individuals that may own, 3 or 4 properties. Perhaps this individual does. That income that they derive from that is income that they live off of. The financialization side is a much different picture. They're bundling hundreds of properties together and extracting income and then distributing that to investors. So just to make that distinction. And we do talk to tenants, and some of them say, I have a great landlord. I know them personally. They only own a few properties. It's an entirely different experience. And often when those people have economic difficulties or challenges, they can talk to the landlord. They can work it out. They have a kind of relationship. This does not exist for the corporate landlords. In most cases, people are interacting with these corporate landlords, the largest ones, through a portal online. That's it. There's not even a property management company office, especially if you have a single-family home.
We've got an email from a listener who wanted to remain anonymous saying, I'm in a dispute with my landlord for not replacing a water heater and air conditioning unit that have broken down multiple times. My property manager showed up to my home and told me he got an eviction order. I thought he was bluffing, but it turned out to be true. I was evicted and provided no notice, service of process. I saw the attorney for my landlord in the exact same address as the process serving company. Have you heard of other instances of evictions proceeding without actual service of process or a posting on the front door? It seems like that would be a potential driver behind the eviction rate.
Yes, it happens. This happens routinely because I'm involved with something called the Jax Tenants Union. We have about 200 members, and also because of the project that I'm working on, the Jax Rental Housing Project, I get a lot of emails from people who are reporting on these very same issues. And often the problem is that the property neglect has reached a point where some aspect of the living conditions are intolerable, and they're constantly demanding that they be addressed. And often they are viewed as an individual doing this as a nuisance, and they are retaliated against, and often they are pushed out, and they are told that they're going to be evicted. There is a legal way that evictions take place, and people need to be aware of that, because often what might happen is you may be told that an eviction notice has been posted and filed, but in fact it hasn't. So this is used as a strategy by landlords. And again, the rights and protections for tenants in Florida are meager. We're ranked about 42nd among states if you rank them that way. That's one reason why it's such an attractive place for the corporate investors. They prefer to operate in an environment where the protections are weak, and where filing evictions can be easy, almost costless, and proceed rapidly.
Well, I mean, even in addition to evictions, if for instance, their lease is not renewed, or if their rent is raised $300 or $400 a month, it can effectively become an eviction.
Right. And that's what you would call sort of a voluntary eviction, where, residents are displaced and they can't afford to pay the rent. So that's the natural outcome.
We also did get a message on Facebook from Scott, and he's saying a lot of interpreting correlation as causation. What can you tell us about being able to trace one thing to the other, or whether these are just happening simultaneously and not connected in terms of ownership and the problems?
Well, I mean, if you look at these investment firms' websites, they will tell you straight up that when their primary objective is to extract the most amount of profits for their shareholders as possible, and they do that by extracting more rent through, increased amenities cost, increasing rents overall, decreasing the amount of amenities that are available, and sort of leveraging that. So that is an advertised part of the business model.
We have also charted, since 2019, you've seen a sharp rise in rent, right? So we're investigating what's happening, what's different. And there is a fundamentally different, what I would call almost a predatory corporate landlord approach. So, for example, in 2020, I'm talking about single-family homes here. 11% of single-family homes were purchased in Jacksonville by what we'll call an investor of one form or another, based on the LLC designation. In 2022, that doubled to 23%. For multifamily apartments during this period, 47% of multifamily properties acquired new owners since 2019. So they're purchasing, they're buying up these properties. 87% of those purchases were by either corporate investment or real estate firms. So I think it's a good question, but I think we have documented this pretty well, that this is the singular factor that is driving both rents and the conditions that tenants face in Jacksonville.
And as Katelyn points out, I mean, there are some, and you cite in your report, there are some companies that straight up acknowledge very directly what their business model is. There was a apartment complex in the Arlington area that you found had a lot of problems, was a top evictor, and their webpage describes their business model. It says that they were going to buy the property, quote, then target increased cash flow, lower expenses, and maximized value potential, which is, pretty clearly that they were going to buy a property, increase the rents and fees, and reduce services.
Yeah, I mean, that's the business model. I mean, like, if you're not constructing a new property, the only way to make profit off of an existing property is to raise the rents. So that is what they advertise.
It also helps when you sell it, because there's a lot of short-term-ism here. So they may own it for 5 years. You're obviously going to get more for that property when you finally exit, so to speak, if you can show that you've been able to extract high rents. So the whole system incentivizes this kind of behavior. And the property management companies are hired by the corporate entities. And so that's who they're serving. They're not serving the tenants. They're serving their clients. Their clients are the person who hired them, and that's the large corporate landlord.
And we should say this report is not all gloom and doom. You do have some solutions that you suggest at the end. One, based on the fact that there really is, other than perhaps this report, there really is no good repository to find problematic problematic landlords, problematic properties, no way to effectively report other than sort of call the local news and have them come out and do a story about your rats. But you propose creation of an office at the city level. What would that do? How would that help?
Well, that was actually Jaffee's proposal, but Jaffee, go ahead.
Yeah, well, this was part of the Tenants' Bill of Rights that we were trying to get passed in Jacksonville. And as Katie mentioned, there was a Tenants' Bill of Rights in the other major cities in Florida. They had been established. The legislature voted for preemption, which meant that no locality could pass an ordinance that in any way regulated the relationship between landlords and tenants. So all those Tenant Bill of Rights that had been passed in those other cities were null and void. There are two provisions in the Tenants' Bill of Rights that are still allowable. They're not prohibited, and we're pushing those pretty hard. I worked with Florida Rising on this, and one is to establish an Office of Housing Resources, or we originally called it Tenant Advocacy, but some people thought that was too much advocacy for one side. But it's a housing office, and the other is a landlord registry that would be available, publicly searchable, available, that would provide information on the actual owner of every single rental property and all the relevant information you would need if you were going to make a decision about whether you wanted to rent from that landlord.
Well, we will stay abreast if those develop. David Jaffee, Katelyn Renzi, thank you so much for coming on today. And again, Katelyn's report is on the First Coast Connect website if you want to see it. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.